Forget the official timeline. Forget the early whispers on the news channels. The single biggest, most expensive warning sign that the world was about to shut down permanently didn't come from a lab, it came from a stage. I'm talking about the Rolling Stones. Stop scrolling right now because we are diving deep into the Impossible Timing Concertos 2020. We are analyzing the moment when the biggest players in music, artists whose tours are billion-dollar logistical nightmares, suddenly, quietly and suspiciously started hitting the brakes weeks before governments admitted we had a problem. Think about the sheer scale. Cancelling a stadium tour is economic suicide. It costs millions just in refunds and logistics fees. Yet in the early weeks of March 2020, before the crisis was officially labeled a global catastrophe, we saw a sudden surge of suspicious concert postponement. The Rolling Stones, Pearl Jam, Madonna, they weren't just cancelling a single gig because Mick Jagger had a cold. They were pulling the plug on entire continents. Was this just hypervigilance? Or did the inner circle of the music industry, the booking agents, the security firms, the people who handle the logistics of moving 50,000 people a night, get an insider tip that the rest of the world missed? This wasn't just concert cancellation chaos. This was a coordinated, preemptive strike against an unseen enemy. We felt the initial sting of frustration postponed shows, but we didn't stop to ask, how did they know? We are looking at the possibility that the entertainment industry, the first ones to feel the financial tremor of a shutdown, were also the first ones to receive the highly classified memo about the looming crisis. Could the history of the 2020 pandemic actually be written through the lens of pandemic prediction shows? If you were already shocked by that, hit the like button right now and tell me this. Which major tour cancellation made you realize the world was truly changing? Drop your theory in the comments below. We're just getting started. Stop scrolling. Forget the official timelines the news gave you. We are about to look at the biggest logistical puzzle of 2020, and it suggests that some people, some very famous people, knew exactly what was coming long before the rest of us even considered buying hand sanitizer. I'm talking about rock and roll, specifically the massive stadium-sized cancellations that happened in the first quarter of 2020. Think about this for a second. Cancelling a major stadium tour, say the Rolling Stones, Taylor Swift, or even BTS, is not like cancelling a dentist appointment. It is an act of economic warfare. These tours are planned years in advance. You have to book stadiums, secure permits, coordinate hundreds of staff, move tons of equipment across continents, and sell millions of tickets. The financial penalties for pulling the plug are staggering. You risk hundreds of millions of dollars. So why did some of the world's biggest acts, who rely entirely on touring revenue, start quietly pulling the plug on their 2020 schedules in late February and early March? This was a time when officially the major health organizations were still telling the global public that the risk was minimal. Let's zero in on a critical example, the Rolling Stones. They had scheduled a massive US stadium run, the No Filter Tour. By mid-March 2020, they announced a full postponement. Now, sure, March 2020 is when things started getting real for everyone, but the initial internal discussions, the actual logistical breakdown, and the legal maneuvering to trigger the cancellation clauses had to start weeks, possibly a month, earlier. To understand the lead time, you have to look at the sheer scale of the operation. Imagine an aircraft carrier trying to turn around in a small harbor. That's what a tour cancellation is like. You have to stop the manufacturing of merchandise, halt the travel arrangements for the stage crews, renegotiate contracts with local security firms in dozens of cities, and, most importantly, deal with the insurance underwriters. This is where the story gets really interesting. Mega tours are covered by incredibly complex insurance policies, often called non-appearance or cancellation insurance. These policies are designed to protect against natural disasters, political unrest, or the star getting sick, but they usually have strict exclusions. If the band simply gets nervous, the policy doesn't pay out. So, for these multi-million-dollar tours to cancel before an official, globally recognized government mandate forced them to, it suggests that the risk assessment data they were receiving was fundamentally different and far more accurate than the data the average person was getting from public health announcements. We're not talking about psychic visions here. We're talking about privileged information streams. The moment a band's corporate lawyers and their underwriters begin modeling the financial risk of a global pandemic, they aren't looking at CNN. They are looking at private data from global logistics firms, proprietary travel risk assessments, and internal projections from reinsurance companies who cover the entire world's risk. These financial models, designed to save billions, were screaming "pull out now" long before the official declaration. Think of it like this. The public was reading the weather forecast for tomorrow, but the rock stars' insurance companies were reading the highly classified long-range climate models for the next 6 months. And here's a detail that most people miss, a real plot twist: the wording of the initial cancellation announcements. Many early announcements didn't explicitly cite the health crisis as the sole reason. They often used vague language about logistical complications or unforeseen scheduling issues. This was a legal chess move. By not immediately claiming a pandemic event, they were hedging their bets on triggering specific clauses in their insurance that might be less restrictive than a force majeure clause tied directly to a government shutdown. It was a calculated retreat, executed with military precision, based on intelligence that few others possessed. If this analysis of the corporate timeline blew your mind, hit that like button right now and comment below. Which band's cancellation do you think was the most suspicious? Because we're just getting started. The speed at which the entire industry pivoted was unprecedented. Suddenly venues were empty, contracts were shredded, and equipment was parked. It wasn't a slow reactive process, it was a sudden coordinated stop. Now let's talk about the money. When a band cancels, they often have to refund ticket sales. But the massive cost is often the lost opportunity and the sunk costs of promotion. The only way to justify that massive loss is if the projected cost of continuing, the risk of massive lawsuits from audiences getting sick, the impossibility of shipping gear across suddenly closed borders, outweighed the cost of cancelling everything. The fact that the decision makers, the high-powered attorneys, the tour managers, and the insurance brokers all came to the same conclusion simultaneously, weeks before the rest of the world caught up, isn't evidence of a conspiracy. It's evidence of a completely separate information ecosystem, one that prioritizes massive risk mitigation over public messaging. And there is one last chilling detail you absolutely need to know. When the tours eventually did try to reschedule, the initial proposed dates were often overly optimistic, clustering in the late summer of 2020. But almost immediately, those dates were pushed back again, often into 2021. Why? Because the same financial modeling systems that predicted the initial shutdown also projected the duration of the crisis with terrifying accuracy. They knew the initial wave wasn't a 2-month problem, it was an 18-month logistical nightmare. The insiders weren't just predicting the start of the storm, they were mapping its duration. The rock stars didn't have a crystal ball, they had the best, most expensive risk analysts money could buy. And their predictions became the ultimate, unofficial warning sign that 2020 was going to be anything but normal. Stop scrolling. I need you to look at a calendar, specifically February and early March of 2020. Forget the stock market crash. Forget the toilet paper frenzy. We are talking about something way bigger, something that costs millions of dollars to pivot, the global music industry. What if I told you that the biggest rock stars in the world, the ones with the best managers, the sharpest lawyers, and the deepest data access, were already cancelling their tours weeks before the World Health Organization officially declared the global health crisis a pandemic? This isn't about intuition. This is about logistics, money, and knowing how to read the room when the room is the entire planet. When a band like the Rolling Stones or Pearl Jam decides to postpone a massive stadium tour, it's not a casual decision. We're not talking about rescheduling a club gig. We're talking about an operation that rivals a small military deployment. Think about the sheer scale. A major international tour requires booking venues sometimes 3 years in advance. You have to secure thousands of hotel rooms, charter specific cargo planes designed for stage equipment, coordinate visas for hundreds of staff members, and most crucially, purchase massive insurance policies against disaster. Now look at the timeline. On March 11, 2020, the WHO officially declared the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic. That date is burned into our memory, but long before that, when many governments were still saying everything was under control, the biggest names in entertainment were quietly, but definitively, pulling the plug. The Rolling Stones, for instance, had their enormous no-filter tour scheduled. That tour required sending literal tons of complex stage equipment across continents. The logistics chain for that equipment starts moving months before the first concert date. If you wait until March 11th to cancel, you've already spent tens of millions of dollars on non-refundable deposits, shipping costs, and pre-production. So when Pearl Jam announced their postponement of the first leg of their North American tour on March 9th, 2 days before the global declaration, it wasn't a guess. It was a calculated, financially necessary move based on data that their logistics teams, their insurers, and their internal risk analysts were seeing, data that had not yet fully filtered down to the general public. This is where the real mystery kicks in. How did these entertainment empires manage to predict the timing so precisely? They weren't looking at the nightly news. They were looking at the fine print of their contracts, specifically the force majeure clauses. If you're surprised by the sheer complexity and the timing of these cancellations, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started on how the world truly operates behind the scenes. Imagine the tour industry as a canary in the coal mine for global stability. It is the first sector to get hit, and the most expensive to get wrong. When you cancel a stadium show, the penalty costs are astronomical. You have to trigger specific cancellation for cause language in your contracts to avoid losing billions. And those clauses usually require definitive proof of impossibility of performance, often linked to travel restrictions or government mandates. But here is the plot twist, the detail that nobody talks about: the insurance riders. Major tours are protected by incredibly complex multi-million-dollar insurance policies. These policies often include riders specifically covering communicable diseases and government-mandated shutdowns. To even purchase these riders, the insurers, massive global firms, require access to the most up-to-date non-public risk assessments from global health organizations and intelligence groups. Think of it like this. The insurance companies are the ultimate gatekeepers of insider knowledge. They are the ones who have to pay out if the world shuts down. Therefore, they are the ones who are paying top dollar for the most accurate, real-time epidemiological models available, often weeks before those models are released to the public or even to national health departments. The theory isn't that Mick Jagger is secretly a virologist. The theory is that the high-powered corporate risk analysts advising the insurance firms knew the critical mass point was approaching. And when they tell the management teams, if you wait until March 12th, your cancellation claim might be denied because you waited too long after the data became available, the artists move instantly. The insider cancellation wave wasn't a psychic prediction. It was a cold, hard, multi-million-dollar calculation based on proprietary data flowing from the highest levels of global finance and risk assessment. The music world had its own early warning system, triggered not by feeling, but by the financial terror of paying for a tour that couldn't happen. And there is one final detail you won't believe. While the major US and European acts were cancelling based on logistics and insurance, many smaller regional tours, those without the same multinational insurance backing, were initially encouraged to try and wait it out. Their financial risk was lower, but their exposure to the inevitable shutdown was higher. This created a clear divide. The organizations plugged into the global risk network pulled the plug early and cleanly, maximizing their insurance payout potential, while others were left scrambling when the final official hammer dropped. The rock stars didn't know the future, but their accountants and insurers had access to the data predicting it. And that, my friends, is the real sound of the world shutting down. Now tell me in the comments, which concert cancellation in early 2020 was the one that made you realize things were about to get seriously massive? Stop scrolling. Forget hidden government files. The real canary in the coal mine for 2020 wasn't a politician or a public health official. It was Mick Jagger. We are diving into one of the weirdest logistical mysteries of the modern era, the precise, almost psychic timing of major rock tour cancellations that happened weeks before the world officially shut down. Did rock stars know something we didn't? Or were the logistics companies running the show looking at a secret map of global risk? Think about the dates. By mid-March 2020, the world was hitting the brakes, but the decision to pull the plug on massive multi-million-dollar stadium tours like the Rolling Stones' massive no-filter tour or Pearl Jam's highly anticipated Gigaton launch had to be made much, much earlier. Imagine the sheer scale of an international rock tour. It's not just 4 guys and a guitar. We're talking about an operation equivalent to moving a small, highly specialized military battalion across borders. You need hundreds of roadies, tons of equipment, specific venue contracts, hotel blocks reserved a year in advance, and, most importantly, hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in insurance and liability. When the Rolling Stones postponed their North American leg, the official statement often used phrases like, "out of an abundance of caution." This was when many cities were still operating normally. But if you look at the internal data streams used by giants like Live Nation and AEG, the companies that actually run the global concert circuit, they are constantly tracking something far more telling than official government reports: global supply chain stability. If you're planning a show in, say, Miami, you need lighting rigs shipped from Europe, specific staging equipment from Asia, and specialized personnel flying in from Australia. Now here is the secret sauce. These massive logistics firms have real-time access to data showing sudden, unusual spikes in air freight costs, unexpected delays in shipping ports, and sharp downturns in international business travel bookings, especially from regions like northern Italy or Southeast Asia, which were the early hotspots. It's like being able to see the ripples before the tidal wave hits the shore. And this is where the money speaks louder than the health warnings. Tour cancellation insurance policies are often written to cover unforeseen events or government-mandated shutdowns. If an artist or promoter waits until the government declares a pandemic, they might trigger the insurance, but they also risk massive contractual penalties if they cancel too late and breach local mandates. The sweet spot is cancelling just before the official shutdown, citing logistical impossibility due to rising internal risk assessments. It's a massive game of chicken, and the logistics companies blinked first, weeks ahead of the governments, because they were tracking the movement of things rather than the movement of people. The cancellation of concerts wasn't a premonition of disease, it was a prediction of economic collapse and supply chain failure, which is the true early warning signal of a global crisis. Think of it this way. In a traditional disaster, the fire alarm goes off. In 2020, the first sign wasn't the sound of the alarm, it was the massive global music industry quietly unplugging the fire alarm system itself, knowing the building was already burning. Now, if you are finding this deep dive into corporate foresight as fascinating as I am, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, which cancellation announcement made you realize something huge was coming? But there's one more detail that nobody talks about. While the Stones and Pearl Jam were delaying their stadium dates, many smaller independent venues, the clubs and local halls, remained completely open, sometimes weeks longer. Why the disparity? Because the economic inertia of a small venue is manageable, but the economic inertia of a stadium tour is catastrophic. The big players had the data, the insurance clauses, and the financial imperative to move fast. The little guys, bless their hearts, had to wait for the official word, and they paid the heaviest price. This wasn't about rockstar intuition, it was about global corporate risk assessment, operating at a speed and precision the public health sector simply couldn't match. They didn't predict the virus, they predicted the response to the virus, and they acted accordingly. And that, my friends, is the real backstage secret of 2020. If you want to keep exploring the hidden systems that run our world, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. Stop scrolling. Look at this timeline. Before the world officially hit the panic button, before the masks became mandatory, and before government officials even admitted the scale of the threat, the biggest names in rock and pop were already quietly dismantling their multi-million-dollar global tours. I'm talking about the Rolling Stones, Pearl Jam, Madonna, BTS. These weren't small club gigs. These were stadium spectaculars planned down to the second, involving hundreds of personnel and tons of specialized equipment. And they were cancelling, not rescheduling, but outright cancelling, months before the general public understood what 2020 was about to become. The question isn't whether they had secret medical data. The real question is, did the logistics industry know something the politicians didn't? Think about the sheer complexity of a major world tour. It's not like cancelling a dinner reservation. A stadium tour is a massive floating city of complexity. You need visas secured for dozens of nationalities. You need 50 non-standard shipping containers crossing oceans on strict deadlines. You have millions of dollars tied up in non-refundable venue deposits, lighting rig rentals and crew onboarding. When the Rolling Stones pulled the plug on their massive North American stadium leg, which was scheduled to begin in May 2020, they weren't reacting to the headlines of March. They were reacting to internal risk assessment reports from January 2020. This required them to forfeit staggering amounts of money. Why move so early? Because in the world of logistics, you can't turn an oil tanker on a dime. The people running these tours, the Live Nations and the AEGs, operate on a 6 to 8 month lead time for global coordination. Their intelligence network is not focused on public health, it's focused on supply chains, insurance liability, and border clearances. And their supply chains were screaming red flags long before the WHO issued its final warnings. Here's the plot twist that nobody talks about. The intelligence didn't come from a doctor, it came from an insurance broker. By late 2019, As tour managers were finalizing contracts for the first quarter of 2020, they started seeing strange, highly specific clauses appearing in their tour insurance policies. These clauses were designed to exclude coverage for unforeseen global events leading to mass cancellations. Insurance companies, the ultimate risk assessors, were already modeling the catastrophic financial downside of a widespread border-closing event. They weren't predicting the specific virus, but they were predicting the effect of a massive disruption on a scale the world hadn't seen since wartime. If you found this logistics breakdown surprising, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, which band's cancellation timeline surprised you the most? This logistic foresight is what separated the financially savvy from the financially devastated in 2020. They realized that if critical lighting equipment, which often originates from specialized factories in specific regions, was delayed by even 2 weeks, the entire $100 million tour itinerary would collapse. When tour managers saw slowdowns in cargo movement and noticed that visa applications were being processed at a glacial pace in certain global hubs, they didn't need a medical degree to know the house of cards was about to fall. The biggest prediction of 2020 wasn't made by a scientist or a politician. It was made by a road manager looking at a spreadsheet of shipping containers and realizing that the most powerful force on Earth, global commerce, was grinding to a halt. It turns out the true prophets of the pandemic wore earpieces and carried clipboards, not robes. They were just listening to the sound of silence in the global supply chain. Subscribe if you want to keep unraveling the hidden mechanisms that run the world.